And so, our heroes blast out of the spaceport aboard the Millennium Falcon, and we are thrust headlong into the second act of the movie.
But wait, how did we get here? Cause and effect. That wonderful, satisfying, fundamental element of storytelling. It's the thing that turns the somehows into hows, that sets up why a character chooses the actions they take. It's the first marble in the Rube Goldberg machine of good writing, and it is painfully absent in the vast majority of modern media. To show why cause and effect is so necessary for effective storytelling, we're going to take a look at the opening acts of both A New Hope and its cheap corporate copycat The Force Awakens, and dissect exactly why, despite their surface-level similarities, one of these films ends up feeling so hollow. Alright, so everyone already knows the parallels between these two movies. They both begin with an ominous shot of a Star Destroyer in orbit over a desert planet. This Star Destroyer is under the command of a dark helmeted agent of an evil authoritarian regime who is in pursuit of a very valuable data card. This data card has recently come into the possession of a very prominent and very sassy agent of the Freedom Fighters. And just before the regime arrives, the Freedom Fighter smuggles away the data card inside an unusually independent and loyal astromech droid that they then send off alone on the desert planet. The droid is intercepted on their quest by small alien junk traders before being released into the care of a young, enthusiastic dreamer type who was already feeling a bit despondent about their likely future here on planet Sand and who longs for adventure beyond the dunes. The arrival of this droid forces the dreamer out of their status quo, and when they are discovered by the regime, the dreamer and the droid are driven off the planet aboard the Millennium Falcon, and the adventure begins. Now, let's start off with the original movie. Why are we here? What's going on? What's the setup? Why are these characters in this part of the galaxy at this exact moment? Well, there are certainly things that can be extrapolated from the opening of the movie itself, but because this is a Star Wars movie, we have the benefit of a title crawl at the beginning. Princess Leia's ship has intercepted secret plans to the Empire's ultimate weapon, and the Empire desperately wants those plans back. Simple, easy to grasp, and it gives us enough information to guess what's going on in the opening shot. Small ship being pursued by a big ship. This is probably the Empire, and the ship they're chasing is Princess Leia's. Great, but why are they here over Tatooine? The opening crawl says that Leia is racing home, but we are soon to learn that her home is Alderaan, not Tatooine. So is this a mistake? Well, no, actually. At the same time we learn of Leia's homeworld, we also learn that Leia was directly sent to Tatooine by her father in order to recruit General Old Ben Obi-Wan Kenobi to join the Rebel Alliance. We aren't told at this point whether this stopover at Tatooine was a detour on their mission to deliver the plans, or if the interception of the plans was an unexpected occurrence on their mission to collect Obi-Wan. But either way, we have a clear cause for why Leia, and by extension the Empire, is in this system. The Empire is here because of Leia, and Leia is here because of Obi-Wan. That begs the question then, why is Obi-Wan on Tatooine? Well, there are two answers to that. Using only the context from this movie, which is all that was available when the movie released in 1977, we would have assumed that this was Old Ben's home planet, or at least had been for quite some time. Importantly, we learn that he was a close friend and mentor of our protagonist's father, Anakin Skywalker, and had trained him to be a Jedi Knight. Now again, in 1977, there was no mention of a centralized Jedi temple or of Coruscant, so there was no reason to assume that Obi-Wan's training of Anakin would have occurred anywhere other than Tatooine. Of course, with the advent of the prequels, we learn that Obi-Wan positioned himself strategically on Tatooine to keep an eye on Luke after Padme's death and Anakin's turn to the dark side. And this does reinforce the reason for Obi-Wan to be on Tatooine, but it's not necessary in order to make sense of the original movie. The idea of, oh, he's just the town's crazy old hermit and he used to be a friend of my dad's, is still perfectly serviceable as a setup with no additional context necessary. So, to recap, the Empire is here over Tatooine because the person who has their stolen plans, Leia, is here over Tatooine. Leia is here over Tatooine because her father sent her to find Obi-Wan, who lives on Tatooine. Obi-Wan lives on Tatooine because of Luke, though technically Luke lives on Tatooine because of Obi-Wan, so really from a certain point of view, Obi-Wan lives on Tatooine because of Obi-Wan. And even though we won't be discussing them too much in this video, Han and Chewie being on Tatooine is strongly set up as well. They work for and owe a substantial debt to a local crime lord, and where better to make a quick score than a wretched hive of scum and villainy. All of our major players have been set up for the story to take place in a very natural way. Everyone is where they are, when they are, not because the story demands they be there, but because the circumstances in their lives naturally led them to this meeting point. Now, let's pause here and turn our attention over to The Force Awakens. Again, very similar scenario. The evil regime has arrived in the system and is threatening the mission of our plucky rebel with the valuable data. And just like before, we're going to start by asking, why are we here? What's going on? What's the setup? Why are these characters in this part of the galaxy at this exact moment? Well, I'll tell you right away that unlike the original, the title crawl here is absolutely no help. Luke Skywalker has vanished? Who's that? Is he an important figure in the galaxy? What is significant about his absence such that the sinister First Order has now risen? What was it about his presence in the galaxy that kept the First Order from rising before? Also, it says that the First Order has risen from the ashes of the Empire. Okay, so there used to be an Empire, but now that Luke is gone, there's an Order. And they want to destroy Luke for some reason. Okay. Now, what's this? With the support of the Republic. Wait, there's a Republic now too? And a Resistance? So there was an Empire. Now there's an Order, and also a Republic that supports a Resistance. Was Luke part of the Republic or the Resistance, or some third entity? It says General Leia Organa is also searching for Luke, who is apparently her brother. Leia has an old ally who claims to have a clue to Luke's whereabouts, and instead of meeting with the old ally personally, she has sent her most daring pilot to meet with him at something called a Jakku. What the hell's a Jakku? Alright, I'm being a bit cheeky here, but you get the idea. This title crawl is a bunch of gobbledygook, and that's coming from someone who knows Star Wars pretty well. I can't imagine how this reads to someone with no context from the other movies. And you might argue that no one would watch the 7th movie in a franchise without watching the first 6 first, and normally I might agree with you, but the explicit goal of the studio was to make a new Star Wars movie for a new generation. They fully expected this to be some people's first experience with Star Wars, a reintroduction to the zeitgeist. It's not like the 7th movie in the Harry Potter franchise, where the expectation is that you've been following the story of these characters all along. In The Force Awakens, this is pretty much an entirely new cast of characters and an entirely new story in an entirely different era, and thus this title crawl serves much of the same role as the original, introducing this galaxy to ours and attempting to give some foundation to the story we're about to see. But it's so convoluted that even as a lifelong Star Wars fan, I only recognize 5 words on this crawl, those being Luke, Skywalker, Empire, Leia, and Galaxy. And for setting up the first act of this movie, only the last sentence is even relevant at all. Compare that to the original, where not only is the premise much easier to understand, but every word is relevant to the understanding of the opening scene. Stolen plans, evil Empire wants them back. That's it. It's really simple. Instead, here we get a guy that's disappeared, an Order that has risen from an Empire that's looking for the guy who's disappeared, and the guy's sister is looking for him too, and she's a general leading a resistance that's supported by a Republic, and there's an old ally with a clue and a pilot and a Jakku. It's like the worst I Spy book ever. Okay, title crawl bad. That's established, but most movies don't even have a title crawl, so let's go ahead and take a look at this first act on its own merits and see what we can infer. So we've got a Star Destroyer, stormtroopers. Okay, this is probably the First Order. Why are they here? Well, it's pretty clear they're here because they want the information that this old ally is about to give to our daring pilot Poe. But how did they know this meeting was happening? Were they tracking Poe and followed him here? Or were they tracking the old ally and they just so happened to arrive at the same time as Poe? Also, why is Poe here? I mean, we know why he's here because he was sent here by Leia to meet with her old ally. But why is he here? Why him specifically? Was this really expected to be that daring of a mission? There certainly doesn't seem to be any urgency on either Poe or the old ally's part. Maybe it was supposed to be a daringly stealthy mission? The title crawl does call this a secret mission, but if that were the case, then surely Poe wouldn't have flown here in a brightly colored New Republic X-Wing, and he wouldn't have parked it in a highly conspicuous spot right outside a small village. If this were a secret stealthy mission where the Resistance believed there was some chance they could be found out, then surely Poe would have arrived on Jakku via mass transport under some sort of cover, and then traveled to meet with the old ally in some less obvious way. Or better still, he would have met the old ally on another planet entirely. More on that in a bit. No, the only thing that could point to Poe possibly trying to stay under the radar here would would be the fact that he's in street clothes instead of the standard flight suit, like we see him wearing later in the movie. Not just any street clothes, in fact. Poe has chosen to wear this very unique and recognizable leather jacket. A jacket which I'm sure will have no bearing on the plot later in the story in any meaningful way. Say, for example, I don't know, maybe this specific jacket just so happens to survive a fiery spaceship crash and gets randomly picked up by one of our main characters. And maybe that random decision to take this jacket fortuitously allows for immediate conflict resolution and provides the perfect cover for him to pretend to be someone he's not. Surely that isn't the case. Anyway, fashion choices aside, the best explanation I can come up with for why the Resistance would send their most daring pilot on a secret mission instead of their most sneaky spy is that they must have expected that the mission would go belly up from the start. So they sent someone with the best chance of making a clean getaway, and that's why Poe is here. Fine, but why is he here? Why Jakku? Was this a randomly selected backwater planet, or was this the Old Allies' homeworld? Either way, wouldn't it make more sense for the Old Ally to go directly to the Resistance? He seems wise, he would probably be a good asset to them, and as we soon come to find out, he has a history with Leia and her family, and sees the return of Luke as making things right. So why would he force the Resistance to come to him? Who even is this guy? Now you may have noticed that so far in this video, I've been referring to this man simply as Old Ally. Now the reason for that is not because he doesn't have a name. He does, but not once, not a single time in this entire trilogy, never once do we hear that name spoken. And that's despite the fact that this man is, and I cannot emphasize this enough, the single most important character in the entire sequel trilogy. I am not memeing here. This is serious. Not a tear is shed for the man who not only provided the information to the location of the Lost Jedi, but merely by his decision to meet Poe on Jakku single-handedly set the stage for the introduction of Rey Palpatine Skywalker into the wider galactic narrative. This cannot be overstated. If this Old Ally did not just so happen to live on Jakku, or if he had gone directly to the Resistance himself, or if he had chosen to meet Poe on some other world, then that's it. Rey is never recruited into the Resistance, the New Republic is destroyed, the Final Order rises, and the Emperor's reign over the galaxy is reinstated. All of that hangs on this one man's decision to meet Poe on Jakku. So let's meet this man and see if there's anything at all that can justify so much weight being placed on a character who is never named, and after he is unceremoniously killed, is never spoken of again. This is Lor San Tekka. But again, he's only referred to as Old Ally in this movie, so I don't blame you for not knowing that. The movie doesn't care about his name, so why should you? Actually, while writing this, Google Docs kept trying to correct Old Ally to Old Sally, so you know what? Forget Lor San Tekka. This is Old Sally. Old Sally is a wizened old man who lives on a desert planet within walking distance of the direct descendant of an intergalactic evilman. Sound familiar? Now, as we discussed, in A New Hope, it's established pretty naturally why Old Ben has a presence on Tatooine. Ben is on Tatooine specifically because of Luke, because of who he is in relation to Vader, and because of the hope that has been placed on him to restore freedom to the galaxy. Ben choosing to live on Tatooine is the sole reason Luke is in this story at all. He's the link that connects Luke to Leia, to the rebellion, and ultimately to the redemption of Anakin and the destruction of the Empire. Old Sally is serving as our Old Ben facsimile for the purposes of setting up this movie. Like Ben, his presence on Jakku is what brings Rey into the story. That begs the question then, why is Old Sally on Jakku? Does he know about Rey's heritage? Is he there to watch over her? Or does he have some other sort of connection to her, to this incredibly important galactic figure? Nope. Old Sally is on Jakku because he thinks it's neat. That's it. That's the reason. It is a pure and unadulterated coincidence that he just so happens to live in the same system, on the same planet, on the same continent, in the same province, within walking distance, or rolling distance I suppose, of the hidden away granddaughter of the Lord of the Sith. Rey, the Messiah, the Chosen One, the only one who can bring balance to the Force and save the galaxy. We are 1 minute and 11 seconds past the title crawl, and already our story is shattered beyond repair. How do I know that old Sally's presence on Jakku is purely coincidental? Well, it's not from the movie, that's for sure. And for a character this important to the story, that's an unforgivable writing sin. But this is Star Wars. Star Wars is famous for its third-party content that expands upon the tiniest little details, so of course there must be some sort of additional information about this character. And yes, of course there is. And there are some things we do find out about old Sally, none of which do anything to fix this issue. In fact, it actually makes it worse. Now, we learn in these stories that old Sally, heir to a family fortune and galaxy-trotting adventurer, became somewhat obsessed with uncovering the mysteries of the Force. He spent a number of years traveling with Master Luke Skywalker and one of his Padawans, Ben Solo, as they sought out the origins of the Jedi. Eventually, this obsession led to old Sally joining a cult called the Church of the Force, after which he retired from his adventuring and exploring and decided to settle down in one of the church's holy cities, a small village on the backwater planet of Jakku. That's it. That's the reason old Sally is here. There just so happened to be a chapter of his cult here, and he was getting too old for this crap, so he figured this was as good a place as any to plant roots. It had absolutely nothing to do with the Imperial heiress, who just so happened to live a short walk away. Now, here's the thing. This wouldn't be an issue at all if Rey wasn't Rey, if she wasn't a Palpatine. If she truly was just the orphan daughter of junk traders, not connected to the grand galactic narrative whatsoever, then there's no issue, because Rey could have been anyone. If Rey wasn't Rey, then BB-8 stumbling upon this scavenger with a heart of gold would be just that. A happy accident, like I was to my parents in 1996. However, that's not the story we got. It's clear from the very beginning that despite Ryan's attempt to subvert it, Rey was always supposed to be a somebody important. A Solo, a Kenobi, or an Antilles, it really didn't matter. All JJ cared about is that you knew she was different. She's not like the other girls. She's a Palpatine. And because she's a Palpatine, and old Sally is blissfully unaware, our setup for this movie is based on pure coincidental nonsense. Actually, it's beyond just nonsense. Setting aside the impossibility of his next-door neighbor's secret lineage and looking at this purely from a character perspective, in agreeing to meet Poe on Jakku, in his own house, old Sally is choosing to endanger his precious Church of the Force village and all the people who live there. His people, his community, this supposed holy site. He is the reason for their destruction. He could have avoided this. Even traveling to Nima Outpost would have been better. And better still, as I mentioned, would be to go directly to the Resistance himself. But no, for some reason, he decides to meet Poe here, in his holy city, among his people, and in doing so, he becomes solely responsible for their deaths. And once again, this is all on top of the fact that he doesn't even know Rey is on this planet. Now maybe, just maybe, if he had known who Rey was and knew the impossible level of power she holds, or to take the cliche route, a chosen one prophecy, then maybe you could argue that he saw the destruction of his village as a worthy sacrifice to that end. But no, he is blissfully unaware of the scavenger savior, and thus in a multitude of ways our setup, the foundation upon which our story rests, is completely and irreparably broken. Broken indeed, but not fully dead. Not yet. It is possible, however unlikely, that a good story can have a broken setup and still be good. A broken or improbable setup is something that can be looked past as long as the story that builds off of it actually makes sense. The setup is like the first domino. Sometimes it needs a little extra push. That's understandable. What really matters is what happens next. How do you handle the follow-through? The Empire has captured Princess Leia's ship and are searching through it for their stolen secret plans. This is an incredibly important matter to the Emperor. Therefore, Darth Vader has shown up personally to oversee this boarding party. He fully intends to find the plans to his master's secret weapon and has no qualms about the lengths needed to go to achieve that end. Princess Leia is the ambassador aboard this consular ship, and we see that she has in her possession the data card that contains the stolen plans. She does not want them to be discovered by the Empire. Therefore, she decides to smuggle the plans off the ship. Lifeform scanners are soon to be established, and it's reasonable to infer that Leia, being both an intelligent political figure as well as an undercover agent of a military force, would likely know that the Empire would be scanning any jettison pods for lifeforms. If these plans have any chance of reaching the surface, she cannot be the one to take them there. But of course, she can't just put the plans in the pod by themselves. Therefore, she stores the secret plans inside a droid. The droid she chooses for this mission, R2-D2, cannot speak Basic. Therefore, Therefore, she records a message on his memory bank so that her instructions on what to do with the data can be made clear to the intended recipient. Meanwhile, C-3PO is absolutely losing his circuits. He fears that he and his counterpart will be sent to the spice mines of Kessel or smashed into who knows what. Therefore, when the choice is laid before him to either stay on the ship and see his fears realized or join his little friend in the escape pod, he chooses to join the mission, and the two of them launch into space. The Empire in this era is depicted as being hyper-competent, so of course the first place they look for the plans is on the ship's main computer. The plans are not in the main computer, which means someone aboard must know where they are. Therefore, Vader instructs that all passengers be taken alive. A squad of stormtroopers discover Princess Leia hiding on the ship. These troopers are incentivized, by way of wanting to keep their heads attached to their bodies, to obey Vader's order to take all passengers alive. Therefore, they make sure their blasters are set to stun before firing on Leia. Leia is hit by a stun blast, therefore she is stunned. Down on Tatooine, our two droid friends have crash-landed in the desert. Droids in as good a condition as they are would be quite a valuable find for any scavengers crawling the sands. Jawas are such scavengers and spend much of their time crawling the sand in their sand crawlers looking for valuable things to scavenge. Therefore, it isn't long before the droids are discovered by the Jawas. Of course, scavenged droids are only worth as much as someone is willing to pay for them. Therefore, the Jawas head to a farm and trot out their wares to sell, placing these two shiny new droids front and center. Owen Lars is a lower-class moisture farmer and is, as we soon learn, a few hands short for the upcoming harvest. Therefore, when the Jawas arrive at his farm, he is eager to see if any of the droids they have for sale will be useful for the harvest. Of course, your harvest is only worth as much as someone is willing to pay for it, and in order to negotiate out here in the Outer Rim, you'll need to be able to communicate in all the major trade languages. Therefore, Owen's wife Beru insists that Owen purchase a droid that can speak one of those languages, Bachi. C-3PO is fluent in over 6 million forms of communication, and not only can he speak Bachi, but also the binary language of moisture vaporators. Therefore, 3PO is chosen. Astromech droids are designed to fix starships, but it's reasonable to assume that those skills would be transferable to farm work. There are several astromechs available here, including our boy R2. However, Owen selects this R5 unit. Now, we aren't told why he made this decision, but it would be reasonable to infer that since R5 is in obviously worse condition than R2, he would be the less expensive option. With a bit of meta information, we can confirm that this is the case, not only due to his condition, but the fact that the R5 model is a more budget-friendly astromech altogether. An R2 SE, if you will. Owen is not a rich man, therefore he selects the cheaper droid. Now, this is probably the most significant moment in this first act. The R5 happens to blow a gasket at this exact moment and stops in its tracks. This allows for R2 to come into the Lars service instead of the R5, which, as we know, is what ultimately leads to Luke reuniting with Ben and eventually joining him on his mission to deliver the droids to the rebellion. That makes this moment very lucky. Now, I want to be clear, it's okay to have a little bit of luck in your story, as long as it really is just a little bit of luck and as long as it's done correctly. Luck done correctly means having a series of perfectly natural circumstances that align in a perfectly natural way, which produces an outcome that happens to be favorable for our protagonist. Nothing unnatural has happened. There's no dark arts or will of the Force at play. It was just a bit of luck. This sort of luck happens all the time in real life. This is when you show up to Buc-ee's right as they pull out fresh, piping hot beaver chips. That is a very desirable outcome for you that you didn't plan for, but the universe didn't have to bend itself to make that outcome happen. You just got a little lucky with the timing. Luck done correctly doesn't contradict cause and effect. It is cause and effect. Contrivance, meanwhile, is luck's evil twin. Contrivance is when a collection of unusual circumstances are forced together in an unnatural way to achieve a manufactured outcome. You can call that luck, but what it really is lazy writing. It is the antithesis of cause and effect, and it's not what's happening in this scene. This R5 unit suddenly malfunctioning here is not some unnatural, contrived occurrence. These are all normal, everyday circumstances that have just come together in a way that a desirable outcome for our robot friend has been achieved. R2 gets to stay with C-3PO and they both come into the service of Luke and his family. This is not contrivance. This is just a good old-fashioned bit of luck. And thanks to this luck, we finally get to meet our protagonist, Luke Skywalker. Luke helps out his aunt and uncle on the farm and is shown to have a good deal of technical knowledge. Therefore, when his uncle purchases these new droids, he is the one instructed to get them cleaned up and ready for work. It's during this cleaning session that we begin to learn things about Luke, how he feels about living living on planet Sand and his dreams of adventure off-world. During this conversation, Luke expresses his interest in the rebellion against the Empire. R2-D2 is still on his mission to find Obi-Wan Kenobi, and this farm boy has just shown that he's no friend of the Empire. Therefore, R2 risks playing part of Leia's message in front of Luke. Mostly, it would seem, in an attempt to get him to remove the restraining bolt so that he can escape. But there is also the possibility that this farm boy might know the name Kenobi. And in fact, Luke does know someone named Kenobi, and he even mentions the general location where he lives. Therefore, his restraining bolt removed, R2 takes the next opportunity to head in that direction. Upon discovering R2's disappearance, Luke is incentivized to find him before his uncle wakes up and realizes what's happened. This isn't just because Luke is a good little nephew, and it's not because he particularly cares what happens to R2 at this point. It's because Luke has a plan, and R2 disappearing on him is not part of that plan. Luke wants to escape the farm, to go to the Imperial Pilot Academy, and the only way to do that is to show his uncle that, thanks to these two new droids, he's no longer needed on the farm. That plan cannot work if one of the droids disappears day one. Therefore, as soon as it's safe, Luke sets out to find R2. Luke and 3PO do catch up to R2, but they quickly realize that they are in Tusken Raider territory. Now, despite any propaganda you might have seen to the contrary, Tusken Raiders are savages. Therefore, they attack Luke, knock him out, and begin to scavenge through his belongings. But Tusken Raiders are also easily frightened. Therefore, when they hear the sound of a dreaded crate dragon, they panic and scatter. Old Ben Obi-Wan Kenobi has lived on Tatooine in the Junlin Wastes for a long time, and has gathered a lot of information about the creatures that inhabit the area, including the Tusken Raiders. Therefore, he knew exactly how to scare them away from Luke. Luke is recovering from being unconscious, and 3PO needs to be reassembled. Ben also mentions that the Raiders will soon be back, and in greater numbers. Assuming R2 was toddling along the sand all through the night, they are likely closer to Ben's home than Luke's. Therefore, they go to Ben's. At Ben's house, Luke and Ben discuss many things, and after hearing about Ben's knowledge of the Force, about his history as a Jedi Knight, and his experience fighting in the Clone Wars, R2 is reasonably certain that he's found his man. Therefore, he plays for him the entirety of Leia's message. This is where we find out that Leia was sent by her father to collect Ben, and we hear her famous plea for his assistance. Now, this moment right here is our hero's initial call to adventure. Ben even says as much. Now, to Luke, this is clearly an intriguing prospect, but despite being offered the chance to finally realize his dream of getting off this rock, he is hesitant. This isn't how it's supposed to happen. He already has a plan. He's gonna work hard to prove to his uncle that he's no longer needed on the farm, to earn the freedom to go to the academy. He's going to be like his father, a pilot. That's his plan. That's the plan. Therefore, he declines Ben's offer. Luke and Ben head back towards the moisture farm. Along the way, they come across the Jawas that sold them the droids, slaughtered. Having just been attacked by the Tuskens, Luke assumes that the same fate befell these Jawas. But Ben knows better. He has had, as we've discussed, years of living among the Sand People, as well as years of military experience. Therefore, he concludes that it was actually the Imperial troops who killed the Jawas. Now, Luke went to primary school. He can do the math. If Imperial troops traced the robots here, they may have learned who they sold them to, and that would lead them back home. And if the Empire was going to these extremes to cover their tracks, then it would not be a leap to assume that they would do the same to his aunt and uncle. Therefore, Luke, horrified at this possibility, leaves immediately to try and save them. You know, like a hero would do. Unfortunately, Luke is too late. His mother and father figures have been brutally murdered, and the farm burned to a crisp. There is no longer anything for him here. The plan is dead. Therefore, he agrees to accompany Ben to Alderaan. Unfortunately, neither Ben nor Luke own a space-worthy ship. Therefore, they will need to hire one. A hive of scum and villainy should do. And within this hive, a smuggler named Han Solo and his first mate Chewbacca are looking for a quick score. Therefore, when two men with deep pockets offer to hire them under the table for a seemingly easy charter, they agree. The Empire is hot on their heels thanks to this nosy fellow, pun intended. And so, our heroes blast out of the spaceport aboard the Millennium Falcon, and we are thrust headlong into the second act of the movie. And now, this. The First Order has arrived on Jakku and are searching for the map to Luke Skywalker. As part of their searching efforts, they begin killing villagers in droves and burning everything in sight. Hopefully they don't accidentally burn the map they're looking for, that would be awkward. Kylo Ren has personally accompanied this landing party. Finding this map is a very important matter to him and to his master Snoke, but it's never made clear exactly why. Why is this map so important? Why do they want to find Luke? I understand that erasing the last Jedi from the galaxy would be a net positive for their plans, and listen, if I had the power to erase the last Jedi from our galaxy, I would as well. But at this point in the narrative, Luke is already gone, and has been for the better part of a decade. There's no reason to think he's going to be back anytime soon, and with the destruction of the New Republic happening tomorrow, why is Snoke okay with both figureheads of the First Order running off to some backwater planet on a rumor about a clue that could lead to where Luke might be? Well, I'll tell you why. Kylo is here because Vader was here. That's it. That's as deep as it goes. Achieving this parallel is all that mattered. The story reasons be damned. Old Sally is the caretaker of the map, and he gives it to our daring pilot Poe right before the First Order arrives. Poe takes the map and runs to his X-Wing, his ball-shaped astromech droid BB-8 tailing right behind him. Two stormtroopers just so happen to spot him and take a few pot shots at his ship. Somehow, those two blaster bolts manage to completely disable the X-Wing's flight systems. That's unlucky. You would think that starships would be a little more resilient than that. I seem to recall another ship that tanked a few dozen blaster bolts as it was taking off and suffered no ill effects whatsoever, but maybe I'm just hallucinating that. Anyway, Poe's X-Wing can no longer fly, but luckily for him, the weapon systems are still fully online. Somehow. Poe uses a drop cannon that X-Wings have now, apparently, to shoot the stormtroopers that shot at him. And after those two stormtroopers are killed, no one else decides to follow up on what they were shooting at. What a blessed oversight on the part of the First Order. Poe gets out of the ship and then puts the map inside BB-8 and then tells him to just go. No directions, no instructions other than just go get out of here. I have to take a moment here to wonder about Poe's plan. He wants BB-8 to roll away into the desert while he goes back to help the villagers, and that he will then somehow come back for him. But my question is, how? How does Poe plan to escape this situation, and more importantly, how does he plan to find BB-8? What technology does Poe expect to have access to that the First Order doesn't already have? Because of course, as soon as they realize that the map isn't in the village, the First Order is immediately going to begin combing the surrounding sands to find out where it went, right? I'm thinking maybe an hour, 2 hours tops before BB-8 is back in the hands of the First Order? How does Poe plan to beat them to the punch? It doesn't make any sense. But in spite of the idiocy of Poe's plan, BB-8 obeys his master and takes off across the dunes. Meanwhile, back in the village, Poe begins sniping stormtroopers with his rifle. The camera focuses on a particular pair of stormtroopers running through the village. Poe shoots the first one, who falls to the ground, but he doesn't immediately shoot the second one, who you'd think would have been the obvious next target, no? The second trooper kneels down next to his fallen friend. The dying trooper's hand is bloody, and he streaks it across the other trooper's helmet. This occurs so that we, the audience, can track this main trooper throughout the following scenes, and for no other reason. The fallen trooper is never mentioned again because when someone dies in a J.J. Abrams movie, they cease to exist in the hearts and minds of the other characters in the story. Speaking of which, Old Sally is brought before Kylo Ren. Yada yada yada, vague meaningless exposition, and then R.I.P. Old Sally. What a waste. It's too bad he was killed before being interrogated though. He probably had some valuable information. He was clearly in direct communication with the Resistance, and if the comic books are to be believed, he'd even been to their secret base once. If only that information could be learned somehow using the, I don't know, Force mind rape? Oh, nope, never mind, he's dead. Shame. Poe decides that this is a good moment to shoot at Kylo, after Old Sally is already dead. Not before, while Kylo was distracted in conversation, and not while he was mid-swing. He shoots now, and even comes out of his cover to do so. What a daring pilot. Kylo freezes the blaster bolt in mid-air. Now, this video is not about the Force, so I will save the diatribe about how this is definitely not how the Force works for another video, and instead ask why. Why would you do this? What purpose does this serve? Even if this was possible, which it's definitely not, why would Kylo expend the incredible amount of energy it would take to hold it in midair? Is he trying to look cool? Is this just, what do the kids call it, aura farming? Am I using that correctly? Poe is captured and brought before Kylo. Kylo recognizes through the Force, I guess, that Poe knows where the map is, but he decides that he cannot pull that information out of his mind here while Poe is restrained. In order to use that particular Force power, he first needs Poe to be restrained. Meanwhile, BB-8 just so happens to get captured by this random little scavenger. Now, unlike the Jawas, who appear to have a large and well-organized operation going on to scavenge the dunes, this little guy is all by himself. One little guy on a slow-moving steed, and he was somehow able to capture the quick-rolling BB-8 with a net, I guess? You know what, good for him. I hope he gets an insane amount of quarter portions for all his hard work. And after capturing his quarry, this little scavenger just so happens to pass by a downed AT-AT walker. But not just any downed AT-AT walker, this downed AT-AT walker just so happens to be the home of our protagonist Rey, and wouldn't you know it, she just so happens to be sitting outside eating her dinner at one of the walker's feet at the exact moment they're passing by. What an intergalactically impossible coincidence. Rey decides unilaterally that this scavenger does not deserve to keep this piece of scavenge that he has scavenged. She tries and succeeds to kidnap what he has rightfully stolen, and rather than fighting back, he just gives up. Oh, how lucky for the galaxy that BB-8 was found by a wimpy little goober scavenger and not a big strong man scavenger, or a Deveronian scavenger, or a Wookiee scavenger. Now, that would have been a different story, I imagine. Although we are soon to see Rey take on multiple grown men in combat at once and win handedly, so perhaps she could best a Wookiee. Rey has chosen to rescue BB-8 because apparently she's quite sympathetic towards droids, to the extent that she's even learned to understand their language. Now, how she received that education on a backwater planet like Jakku is beyond me, but man, it's lucky for the galaxy that BB-8 just so happened to stumble across the one person who just so happened to understand his language. If he'd been found by somebody else, someone normal who hadn't taken the incredible amount of time and energy to learn droid speak, he would be SOL. He would have no way to get back to the Resistance and the map to Luke would be gone. How lucky for the galaxy these two randomly happened to meet. Rey and BB-8 arrive at Nema Outpost to sell some scrap. Unkar Plutt sees this pristine ball droid rolling around with this skinny, defenseless girl and decides that he wants it. He first tries to buy the droid from Rey with an insane amount of quarter portions, but Rey rejects the offer because darned it if she isn't just a good person. So Unkar orders that the droid be seized by force. Unkar, what the hell, dude? Is this how you run your business? If you're not careful, you're gonna lose your BBB accreditation. Back on the Star Destroyer, our main stormtrooper decides to try and break Poe out. He does this by telling the guard that he has orders to transfer him, and that just works. The guard does not question him at all, despite the fact that this guard almost certainly outranks our stormtrooper by a considerable degree. If the guard tried to radio for clearance or had asked a single solitary question, the entire rest of the movie does not happen. How lucky for the galaxy he didn't do that. Our stormtrooper breaks Poe out and escorts him to a hangar bay, where the two of them board a Special Forces TIE fighter. They attempt to take off, but oh good golly Miss Molly, they are still attached to a fuel line. Surprisingly, this fuel line does not have a basic safety quick disconnect that fuel lines have here on Earth. And for a regime that has the technology to shove hyperdrives and TIE fighters and laser cannons in planets, you would think they would have figured that one out, but I guess not. The deck officer is notified of this unauthorized departure. Therefore, hey, look at that, our first therefore. Wow, and would you look at that time code. Therefore, he orders the troops in the bay to shoot the TIE down. Though he could have, I assume, simply closed the bulkhead for the docking bay and the rogue TIE would have been trapped. How lucky for the galaxy he didn't do that. After they blast out of the hangar bay, Poe decides to give our stormtrooper a name. Finn. Finn likes his name. That's nice. And then Poe says he wants to go back to Jakku. Finn does not like this plan, but before they get a chance to discuss it, they are blasted out of the sky and crash on Jakku. The Finn awakens on the dunes, alone and without supplies. He runs back to the crashed TIE fighter, but only finds Poe's very unique and recognizable leather jacket. Poe himself is nowhere to be seen. Finn takes the jacket, and then the TIE fighter is eaten by the dunes, and then it explodes, and then Finn heads off in a random direction and just kinda hopes for the best. Sometime later, Finn arrives in Nema Outpost, having stumbled upon it by absolute chance. How satisfying. It's the desert, and it's hot outside, and he is thirsty, therefore he takes the first opportunity he has to drink water. And there it is, our second therefore. We are 27 minutes into the film, and so far we only have two decisions that have a traceable and understandable reason for being made. One of those decisions is character is thirsty and therefore drinks. This is not a good sign. And then suddenly, Unkar's Plutts begin to rough up Rey. Finn just so happens to be close enough to see it, and he decides to help her out, but why? Is it because it's the right thing to do? Well, maybe, but it could also just be that he's attracted to her. That seems more in line with the purely self-centered motivations that he's displayed thus far in the film, and that he will continue to display until the end of TLJ. But righteous intentions or not, before he can do anything to help, Rey helps herself. This is... yeah, no, we're not getting into that. BB-8 just so happens to look over and see Finn. Finn, as mentioned, just so happens to be wearing Poe's super unique and recognizable leather jacket. Rey just so happens to be able to speak droid, so she's able to understand when BB-8 tells her that this stranger apparently stole his master's super unique and recognizable leather jacket. This leads to Rey and BB-8 confronting Finn, who tells them about Poe's apparent death, and then he attempts to bluff his way into their confidence, and they just believe him. And then the First Order suddenly appears again and begins carelessly shooting up Nema Outpost. Gee, I hope they don't accidentally blow up the map they're looking for, bunch of friggin' idiots. This barrage leads to Rey, Finn, and BB-8 scrambling towards a ship, and then that ship gets exploded, so they pivot and go to another, more different ship. But that ship does not blow up, because this ship is the Millennium Falcon. Oh boy, if you thought old Sally being on Jakku was a contrivance, then the Falcon being here is 10 times that level of contrivance. But because the story demands they be on the Millennium Falcon, behold, the Falcon appeareth. And so our heroes blast out of the spaceport aboard the Millennium Falcon, and we are thrust headlong into the second act of the movie. And although in this video we're just focusing on the openings of these movies, the discrepancies only get more apparent as the stories continue. In The Force Awakens, after they make it into orbit, something randomly starts leaking on the ship, and then Han and Chewie suddenly appear, and then space pirates appear, and then more space pirates appear, and then spaghetti monsters, and then hyperspace. And then this moldy carrot just so happens to have Anakin Skywalker's lightsaber, and she tries to give it to Rey, and then when Rey doesn't want it, she gives it to Finn, and then Rey runs away, and then the First Order destroys the New Republic, and then the First Order arrives on Takodana, and then the Resistance arrives, and then all of these events are completely disconnected from each other. It's absolute insanity. Meanwhile, the opposite is true for A New Hope. The Death Star marks an unknown ship entering the system, therefore they tractor beam them aboard. Han is a smuggler, therefore he has methods of avoiding detection by the scanning crew. Vader and Obi-Wan have a strong connection, therefore they sense each other's presence and recognize that they are fated to meet one final time. Luke has a soft spot for Leia, therefore when they discover she's being held here on the Death Star, he is anxious to go rescue her. Han has a soft spot for money, therefore when he learns that Leia is loaded, he agrees to help rescue her. Tarkin and Vader want to find the rebels' base, therefore they plant a homing beacon on the Falcon and allow our heroes to escape and lead them there. Therefore, every domino falls into place, not because the writer is knocking over each one individually, but because all the dominoes are connected from the beginning. Now this channel is still pretty young, but of all the topics I've covered so far, plot devices, world building, spectacle over substance, really what it all boils down to is this. It's cause and effect. The best plot devices follow a straightforward cause and effect. The strongest world building adheres to a strict set of internally consistent rules, and it's fine to have spectacle as long as the story that leads up to that spectacle actually has substance. Cause and effect is the substance. It's the mortar that holds all these elements together. And it's the reason that the quality level of these two movies are so drastically different, despite the fact that they both begin with very similar setups, with similar plot points, with droids in the desert. Thanks for watching.